Well, welcome everyone to this live conversation today. I'm so excited to have you all with us, to have Michaela with us, Dr. O'Donnell. My name is Magdalene Maleka. I'm the director with Fuller Careers and Personal Development. Before we get started, I'm just going to share a couple housekeeping things. One, as you've probably already seen, this will be recorded, and God willing, you'll all get a recording sent to you via email in a day or two. Secondly, if you need translation, please feel free to select the interpretation globe icon, and we have live translators in both Spanish and Korean. So we'll give you a second to do that. You're always welcome to turn on closed captioning if you'd like as well. And my colleague Lilia Sequeira, she will be dropping in a link on the chat for any questions that you want to submit during this live conversation. As a live conversation, you are welcome to put comments into the chat directly, anything you want to just reaffirm, confirm, highlight, and then you can put your questions into the form. All right, without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Magdalene Maleka. I'm director with Fuller Careers and Personal Development. We are an office that serves our students and alumni to provide really education and equipping individuals on navigating career management, career resilience through a holistic approach, both with Christian-based practices, spiritual truths, and also, employability data and career services best practices. So we're trying to merge all that for a really holistic and effective approach to career management and resilience at whatever stage in your career you're in. So we're here to support you as students and alumni. We're also very, very excited to have Dr. Michaela O'Donnell with us. She's the executive director of the Fuller Pree Center, which focuses on equipping leaders. And also the Pree Center is a resource that Fuller students and alumni are welcome to access, to view, to connect with. And we want you to be able to be aware of all those resources that Fuller as a whole ecosystem is really trying to support you in your own pursuit and discernment of your vocational goals and your professional formation. So I'm going to actually turn this over to Dr. O'Donnell to see if she will just give us a brief introduction about her office and also herself.
Well, thank you. Please call me Michaela. It's great to be with you, Maggie. Little known fact, Maggie and I used to, in the Fuller offices in Pasadena, we used to have our offices in one of those houses together. Yes. And that's where I first started to get to know Maggie and appreciate the very good work that she and her team are doing. And to be quite honest, I wish I had, I was a Fuller student. I got both a master's and a PhD at Fuller. I wish I had taken more advantage of your office, Maggie. I wish I had the foresight to do so. So I applaud people who are tuning into the conversation today and who are actively pursuing the really wonderful resources that you're offering. So thanks for what you do. Yeah. Like Maggie said, my name is Michaela O'Donnell. I am the executive director of the Max Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller. We are one of the centers of innovation. By and large, our sort of charge and call is to consider and think about leaders that are not necessarily going into ministry, but are serving in the wider world. We sometimes call that wider world the marketplace. We are named after Max Pree, and Max Pree was longtime CEO of Herman Miller, which is actually an office furniture company. I'm sitting in one of the chairs right now, if you can see me. There we go. Both Maggie and I are sitting in Herman Miller furniture. And we are sitting in Herman Miller furniture because Max was also a longtime chairman of the board at Fuller Seminary. And I never got to meet Max. Max passed before I came into this role. But one of the things that is commonly, let me put it this way, this isn't commonly said, but I've derived this picture about Max, is that he was who he was wherever he was. And it's that kind of seamless integration, right? He's in the boardroom, he's CEO, he's a granddad, and someone who's living seamlessly between those spaces, especially in terms of faith and work and leadership. It's that very thing that at the Pree Center, we're trying to help leaders do as well. So that's just a bit about my work. I'm here today. I just wrote a new book, and we're going to be talking more about it, but I wrote a book called Make Work Matter. Yes, Baggy has an early copy. Listen, y'all, I'm gonna tell you, you're gonna be letting on the inside of this. So this book was supposed to come out a few weeks ago, and I got a call from my publishers about 2 weeks before launch day, and they were they're very good and generous and smart people, and I'm very grateful for them. And they were obviously a little distraught in this phone call. They said, "We have some bad news to deliver to you, Michaela." And I said, "What's that?" And they said, "The printer ran out of paper for your book." And I thought, well, if that isn't the changing world of work, and if we can't talk about supply chain demands in this conversation, I don't know where we can talk about them. So now the book officially comes out next week, but it's called Make Work Matter, Your Guide to Meaningful Work in a Changing World. And it's really for all of us doing the holy wrestling and trying to kind of untangle ourselves from mantras that don't quite work about work, and do some discernment, and it's really a field guide and kind of a hands-on guide. So we'll talk about that. Maggie, I'll stop there in terms of way of introduction.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to say, so we were really excited to see the responses coming in from those who are registering for this event. We were praying over, thinking about the responses, and I just wanted to share that a majority of individuals who were signing up for this event were really excited or interested about the topic, seeking a new perspective or insight about God and work, or where is God and meaning in my work, or if I'm not working, what does that mean? And then there are quite a few individuals, about a third of the registrants, are just in a discernment phase. They're not quite sure what happens next, or because of the last year, or just because of where their life is at, they're in a season of transition. And so this topic of pursuing meaningful work in a changing world is very, very relevant, we know, is very timely, obviously, because it matters within our control and those outside of our control mostly. And for my own personal and professional highs and lows, I've always been fascinated with topics of formation and resilience. And I think all this comes to a head. I'm really excited to have Michaela here with us. Michaela, your PhD dissertation was on adopting an entrepreneurial posture, vocational formation amidst a changing landscape. So landscape of work. So a lot of the work that you did for your dissertation is poured out into this book, I'm sure, as you share anecdotes and research and stories and practical guides. So we're really happy to have you with us today and sharing your insight, your thoughts, and the kind of collective stories you've gathered over time.
Thank you.
So I am curious, I wanted to ask you to share for the group what brought you to that kind of interest. What made you decide to pursue this in your PhD program, and in your dissertation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Maggie, you just made me feel 1,000 times better. I have written on and studied and am an entrepreneur, but the word continues to be very hard to say. Entrepreneurial is harder to say. Now try to go spell the words. I think now I'm still having to do spell check every time I write them. But yeah, that sort of, so thank you for helping me there. Yeah, honestly, y'all, this work, so like Maggie said, my dissertation, which I did, 4 years ago now, was on a changing world of work and what does vocational formation look like in that changing world of work. And I come from a family of entrepreneurs and teachers, big Irish Catholic families in the Midwest, in Nebraska, here in the States. And so my biases are all towards, sort of that way of thinking. But it actually came through kind of a crux and a crisis, and maybe not dissimilar from some of the folks, at least in some of the data survey responses that you named, Maggie. I got a master's from Fuller. My husband got a master's from Fuller. We both graduated in 2010 and 2011. And that was right in the middle of what was called the Great Recession. And it was hiring freeze after hiring freeze after hiring freeze. And for anyone wanting to pursue nonprofit or ministry work or church work, everyone was cutting their budgets. They weren't hiring. And we found ourselves with a set of very difficult questions that came down to, how are we going to pay rent, and how are we going to pay our groceries, and are we going to have to move and sort of go back home and be with our families, which would have been another viable path, right? But so we came out of a lot of wrestling in that period. Again, I come from a family of entrepreneurs. It was my instinct to try and start a business in that time period. Now, if that is insane as it sounds, it actually was quite the naive decision. But my husband is a very good sport, and so we started a company that does video and branding. That company has been operative for about a decade now. And my husband has a lot of artistic. He's an artist. He's an artist who went to seminary. In many ways, I'm a businesswoman and a leader who went to seminary. Right? You could probably, many people could say that for yourself. you're a helper, or you're a, you know, a storyteller, you're a friend and a seminarian, right? And so we were out there doing our business and doing our thing, and eventually I had some mentors back at Fuller say, we feel, Michaela, like you've got some gifts for the church. You should come back and consider doing PhD work. I'm like, forget it. Like, absolutely not. Why would I do that? I've learned, you know, we're doing good. We're paying our rent, you know, buying a house, doing kind of that basic life stuff. And I just I kept feeling God's, it was like a nudge, you know, just like, I think God speaks to us in different ways in different time periods. And that season, I just kind of getting a little like nudge. And so eventually I ended up back in school. And when it came time to do my dissertation research, of course, it was my own life experience. It was my own stuff that I was trying to work out. And that led me to the process of asking, how might we walk out with more tools? How might we thrive, if you will, in a changing world of work? That eventually led me to the Pree Center, where then we started doing cohorts around the same material that's in the book. As of now, we've had about 250 people go through those cohorts. Those are called Road Ahead. So now the stuff's been road tested, and it was time to write the book version. So that's how I got to studying all that, Maggie.
That's great. I mean, you talk about empathy. Obviously, you were experiencing it real hand for yourself. What out of your own experience, you were finding yourself moving towards certain subjects, certain types of people. And so I think that there was real muscle of empathy being built also, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, empathy, we might talk about it a bit later, but it's pretty much the whole package in terms of thriving in a changing world of work. And empathy was not a skill that came super naturally to me. For some of you, it's your superpower. You're like, what? I ooze empathy. I move towards everybody all the time. But in those moments, for whatever reasons, like life stuff coming up, I was like here. And I realized like the move to here and toward people was critical to the meaning and the direction and all the stuff I was craving, actually getting outside of my own head and moving toward people. And now to be able to empathize with people who are in that same place that I've been at, not just in the time I described, but in time since. It feels, honestly, it feels like secret ground.
Yeah, not that I want to make it like this overly Pollyannish thing about all bad things turn to good, but it's interesting how your experience in that recession period led you to further wanting to explore this. And that's, you know, out of you wanting to process it, you went into further work in this area. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I think, oh, go ahead.
No, go.
I was going to say, I really like Richard Rohr's take on this. And, you know, it's basically, if you don't do the work, right? If you don't do the work for pain to transform you, you're going to end up transmitting it on lots of other people. And who wants to walk around the world inflicting harm and pain on people? You know, probably not any of us who are on this call. And so but in order to not accidentally do that, it's like, you gotta do the work with that pain.
Yeah. Well, so now let's talk about a pain point for some people, maybe not for others, but what exactly are you seeing in this changing landscape of work? What are we noticing right now?
Yeah, I've been using the phrase that we are in a peculiar and particular time right now, right? I talk to people about their work. First of all, if you would have ever told me 10 years ago, Michaela, you're going to spend your time talking to people about work, I would have been like, hard pass, like that. No, I don't think so. And now I'm like, oh, it's so fun to do. I actually love work and I love talking about their work. 3 or 4 years ago, Maggie, I'd walk into a room and I'd kind of announce to people, I'd say, the world of work has changed. And I would see resonance in people's body language. I'd see them like, oh, they kind of sigh, or they'd nod, or they'd kind of sink into their chair that told me they were processing something that maybe hadn't been said aloud. Now, if I told anybody on the screen that the world of work has changed a lot in the last couple of years, they might be like, yeah, and the sky is blue. And have you been living under a rock? The whole world has changed in the last 2 years. And in many ways, the last couple of years have accelerated changes that were already in motion. Take some simple things like the fact that we're on Zoom right now. You know, there were webinars 3 years ago, but we weren't as constantly doing many of our work capacities, and this isn't across industries, but in certain industries, we weren't doing it on Zoom. We weren't working at home as much, right? That's kind of a newer thing in the last couple of years. If you were working from home, you were sort of the outlier. In many cases, the very work people are doing is changing. I've been starting to travel again in the last 6 months, and I was taking a Lyft home, and I was talking to the guy, my Lyft driver, and I was like, "How's it going? How you doing?" Just normal conversation. He's like, "This is my first day back in a Lyft." I was like, "Oh, first day back. Have you not been driving since the pandemic?" And he said, "No, I've been driving Instacart. I've been driving a food delivery service." And he's like, "And now food delivery service is starting to go back down, and demand for Lyft is starting to go back up." And it was this little story that reminded me that the very things that we deem necessary to function as a society, they're dynamic, they're changing, right? And it sometimes is ebbing and flowing, which has an impact on us and the activities that we do or the jobs that we take on. But right now, there's this really interesting phenomenon that's happening, Maggie. It's called the Great Resignation. Some people, Maggie, I know you're aware, you're an expert in this space. And the Great Resignation is that it's anywhere between 30 and 60% of people, depending on what data source you look at, are thinking about quitting their jobs. In August and September, we actually saw the highest number of resignations from jobs in 20 years. So people are making moves. People are thinking about making moves. And in many ways, this is some might say, okay, well, yeah, but if 2 or 3 years ago, if you Googled how many people don't like their work or how many people are disengaged, you'd get the stats that were the same, 40 to 60 to 80% difference in that people are actually moving right now and thinking about moving. And I think that has a bunch to do with the meaning making, right? It's like, I don't really want to work for a toxic boss. Like, I've only got so many days. This industry, like, I can't even get basic things like healthcare, and people are treating each other kind of like, not very good. And I don't want to be part of that. And as Christians, people are saying, well, what might God be inviting me to in this moment? And so there's layers and layers, and in terms of what we're noticing. And in many ways, what I've said there is just the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely. Yeah, we know from our office, just the few encounters we had with students, some individuals were either coming to Fuller or switching their focus and their degree because they were feeling called to chaplaincy work because people were struggling and dying inside of hospitals. They just felt like that's the place that God is calling me to. So they were making that pivot in real time. So definitely this great resignation, I'm seeing that as well. I'm hearing that at least in the anecdotes as well. And for those who are curious and interested in that kind of those data sets, I know Gallup does a lot of research on engagement and disengagement, active disengagement at work. So we'll send some resources after this event for those who want to read on. So I want to pivot a little bit. So I know that there's an area of your book, and in many different places, you talk about the power of identifying and naming how we're feeling in these seasons. And I wondered if you can summarize a little bit from the data that you collected and from the conversations that you've had with the cohorts, even how are people feeling right now in all this change?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I was doing a podcast earlier this morning. I was recording one, and somebody said to me, "You talk about feeling so much in your book. That surprised me for somebody who writes about work." And I said back, like, most of us have a lot of feelings about work. Like, we've got a lot of feelings about our careers. And I actually think talking about those feelings is really critical to the work. And I've had to name my own feelings, right, in the last couple of years, in terms of feeling overwhelmed and feeling exhausted and feeling kind of this wornness. And those are feelings I've been hearing from others. And let me just name some here. And this would be less data driven, more anecdotal, because it's coming up over the last couple of years, though we're starting at the Pree Center to do a bit of this kind of more data driven research. We don't have any reporting on it yet, but overwhelmed, anxious, actually, right? Of course we feel anxious. Like, it's like, how's it all going to turn out? And we're in the midst of so much change. And oh my goodness, there was or has been, depending on how you feel about it, a global pandemic. So anxious. Lonely is a word I hear a lot. I hear people just describe, like, I'm trying to figure it out by myself, and that's really lonely. I don't know if it's a feeling word, but I hear burnout a lot. Like, there's not enough capacity to do all the things that I've either been told or think I need to be doing. Also, though, Maggie, I hear hope, and I hear a desire for hope, right? So I hear there's curiosity about what might be, because anytime change is happening, there's both grief and loss and also opportunity. And so I hear kind of that tension that people feel. Yeah, those are some of the words I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, as a live conversation, we actually want to invite the participants to feel free to write into the chat whatever feeling or emotions best describe how you're feeling about your work in the season, or your lack of work in the season, wherever you're at. So feel free to write in the chat. We'll give it about a minute just to let what we've talked about thus far to simmer a little bit. Then we're going to pivot and start talking about what exactly is meaning, and some very particular kind of quotes and themes from the book. So we'll pivot in just a minute. I also want to remind everyone that if you would like to submit your questions, you can do so via the form that Lilia just dropped into the chat. So thank you for those who are starting to write into the chat how you're feeling. We see that. We hold that with you.
Yeah.
I think I'm the type who kind of toggles between the extremes, and it just depends on the day and the week and what's happening in my personal life, what's happening at work.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. It's interesting, even as I'm watching these names, come in, it's kind of like, there's a toggling, and this is maybe a bit more up here, but I'm wondering, does the toggling happen, some days I'm feeling, just exhausted, and other days I'm feeling hopeful, or in some weird way, am I feeling both at the same time? And even that ambivalence, what does that do to us, that we're feeling multiple feelings right at the same time?
Yeah.
Such good words coming in. Yeah. Feel you.
Well, I invite everyone to continue to please feel free to write in your emotions, thoughts, like I said, any comments that you want to make. We're going to pivot in this next kind of section, and hopefully we'll even pause for some live questions that I'll have Lilia share if anybody submitted any. But I want to kind of focus in this section on clarifying your meaning for some of the words that you were using. And some quotes that we use in the promotion for this webinar really seem to hit a nerve with people when we talk about passion and perfect jobs and things like that. So let's start with maybe asking you, if you don't mind. So we're talking on making work matter and pursuing meaningful work. And then the real question is, well, what is meaning? What does matter, and whether it's paid or not? Can you talk a little bit more about that? How do you define work that's meaningful?
Yeah, that's really good and really core. And I'll answer it, but I'll give a caveat that there can't be one size fits all here. There just can't. It's just not a one size fits all. The kind of ironic thing and welcoming thing at the same time is that our work doesn't necessarily matter because of how we feel about it. Our work matters because it matters to God. And I think it feels very basic, but we don't always have proximity to that truth, and this is Genesis 1, it is critical that we see God as a maker, a creator, a worker, right? Before we see sin. So we get a pick, and then God's commission, the creative calling in order to, when God makes human in the image of God. I just think that's really critical. And so there is a goodness to work that we feel in our bones and then don't feel in our bones because of lots of other reasons, that just has a lot to do with the fact that we are God's and we are made in the image of God. And therefore our work, whether we're paid to do it or not, is an opportunity for goodness and for participation with God. When we talk about work, we usually mean paid work, don't we, Maggie? Or it's like paid work. I think that's common vernacular. However, so I'll just, I would say that maybe the work that takes up the most time in my life right now is the work of mothering. I have two small kids. I have a daughter who's 6 and a son who's 2.5, and I love them and I love time with them. And parenting is a whole job. It is it's work. And no one's paying me to do that. Like, of course no one's paying me to do that. And even the thought that someone would pay me to, mother my own children is kind of an absurd thought. And yet we don't always like count that. And so I think even just expanding the categories of the places in which we're doing work with God is an important step. But then there's this kind of individual sense of meaning piece, right? And like, oh, we want our work to matter. We want our work to matter to us. And I think we need to just admit that we want our work not just to matter to God, but to us. And I don't know, we might have thoughts and feelings about that, right? Like, I don't know.
I was going to ask you, do you think that's a problem?
No, I don't think it's a problem. I think we just have to name it for what it is.
Yeah.
And place it in the right place. And here's the other caveat there is that, I think people in mainstream are talking about work that more than they have in a long time. And there's a writer I really like that writes, Derek Thompson for The Atlantic sometimes here in the States. And he talks about something called workism. And I don't know if you've seen these. Have you seen this, Maggie? No.
Phrase is familiar, but I'm not sure if I'm
okay. So you have to see what you think of this. It's basically the idea that in American culture, which certainly isn't ubiquitous at Fuller, but is sort of the central context for his writing, we have traded organized religion for the religion of work. And that is the place where we want to get our meaning and significance, both in terms of who we connect to. I saw Jasmine wrote in here earlier, people are actually looking for workplaces to be more like the church. So there's this communal nature of it. And I think she's right on, but also just in terms of our own sense of significance, right? I'm a this, and there's just a lot of identity. Yeah. What do you do for a living? What do? You meet someone for the first time. What do you do? And there's tons of individual identity making that comes through the vein of work. Now, this is where I would say that's a whole lot of pressure to put on work. And I'm not sure that lines up with how God talks about work and calling. And, never in the Bible does it say calling equals a paid job. And so in order to, what's ironic here is in order to get to the meaningful work we crave, we've got to first start by taking some of the pressure of all of our meaning, even more sometimes than we like to admit. Maybe it's not all of it, but whatever percentage of meaning making we're doing through our professional lane, how might we redistribute that in the rest of lives in the world so that we can come back to work without all that pressure on it? Does that, you know what I mean?
Yeah. We often say in our office, you are not your job title, or your value is not your work. Needing to decouple that is really, really important, and helps, like you're saying, to relieve some of the pressure. So if you find that work is not meaningful, to you or to God, let's just say, because we're not going to get into that piece yet about if it's meaningful to us. We're not going to flesh that all out right now. But if we've discerned it's not meaningful, do you think that it's about changing perspective, or is it about changing work? That's a very broad question to ask, I'm sure, but how would you want to address that?
Let me just kind of mirror it back to you. So if we're on a path, whether we're a student on that path or whether we're getting paid to do something, and we're like, this is no longer working. Work isn't working, right? But what do? Do we look for something new? Do we try to reframe what we're doing? I really do think it's contextual. I think that, and if I could sort of back up theologically into this, I do believe that work is good at its core and in the kingdom of God. And I think that as people living on earth, we exist in the midst of multiple kingdoms, right? Now I'm going all the way back to Pharaoh and God rescuing and delivering the enslaved Israelites into the promised land. And, under Pharaoh's rule, it was an anxious, greed-driven, totally corrupt way of, it's enslavement, which included really harsh work and labor. And God says, okay, God doesn't say, hey, you're just going to like chill out in the promised land. God's like, actually, we're going to have rhythm here. We're going to have rhythm of work and rest. And hey, by the way, not just for you, but for everybody who's entrusted to your care. And so I tell that story to say that we still live in the midst of a lot of systems that are, overly greed driven, that are systemically racist and biased or sexist, right? And that it's not so clean. So I wouldn't want to say, yeah, just reframe things and make it work, because sometimes I think an exit strategy is the most faithful thing to do. I really do. And other times, I think that reframing and figuring out how to be part of the redemptive nature of work, a job, a space, a system is the opportunity in front of us. But in order to discern which of those it is, or maybe some of both, that's just very, very contextual. Honestly, which is why I'm so glad that career services exist. That's the kind of stuff, that's the kind of discernment, that very active on the ground. What should I do in these scenarios? Stuff that we each need to be in conversation about, right?
Yeah, and actually a step further, our office doesn't just hope everyone comes to see us. We actually want to help individuals figure out what is the discernment, spiritual practices, the community of discernment that they need to get one level deeper into the contextual side of things. Like, who knows you? Who knows, is this something you're running away from? Or is this really truly God is desiring or pulling you out or something like that? So I think, yes, we definitely can be a place where we're helping to support individuals of what to think about through the discernment process. And likely we'll bring it back to what resources do you have in your life? What are some practical steps and groups you can continue to discern with?
Yeah, Maggie, I don't know if you all are proponents of the career brain trust idea, but what you're talking about makes me think of brain trust. So, brain trust is a concept developed by actually Pixar Animation, so filmmakers. And what they have is they have a brain trust that goes through different films and different stories. And I'm going to use their language here, but their language is the brain trust. Their job is to turn, you know exactly what I'm going to say, don't you, Maggie?
Yeah, I just read it from your work.
Oh, got it. Okay, so to turn things from to help things not suck or not be bad. That's their language. And what they're really saying here is that any given project, when it starts, is muddy and unclear and is headed in different directions, and that there's a group of people that can come around to workshop that to get to its most clear and best self. And I actually think that that's an idea that we can use in our careers. And who knows us well? Who is good at understanding how we're made? Who is good at helping us process things that have and haven't worked? And also, who knows about opportunities? Who can be part of our own career brain trust? And I won't say that we're starting in a place of as they do suck, but going from that kind of, oh, I really can't figure this out, to having a bit more action steps.
Yeah. Well, so there are a series of dysfunctions or dysfunctional beliefs about vocation. I really would love to have so much time to talk about, but we don't. I think the one I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit more on is about the role of passion in work. Is it about finding the perfect job or the thing I'm the most passionate about? What are your thoughts about that? Because we definitely had a lot of registrant responses when we use that quote from your book about passion and just leaning more into God in those times of discernment versus following passion.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't remember exactly how I said it, but often I say something like, passion is not the holy grail of work that we think it is. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think let me throw this back to everybody who's here today. If I said, what are you passionate about? I would predict that many of us would have to sort of search ourselves for that answer. Maybe like, oh, well, kind of, I think I'm passionate about this, or I'm passionate about these people. And that it's not something that's often very clear, really, at any given point. It's especially true when we are coming out of times like school, or we're early career, or we're in transition. And so right at the time that we're trying to make big decisions, if we use passion as a compass for those decisions, like, and we can't, it's like, well, actually, we don't know what we're passionate a bit about, or I kind of like these things, but I don't really understand how they go together. It just ends up setting us up for a lot of heartache and disillusionment and disappointment. So I do think that, eventually figuring out what we're passionate about is good and right. I also think that we should expect it to be dynamic and to change a bit and to grow over the course of a lifetime and a career. And I would say, and I know that you're a big fan of Bill Burnett and Dave Evans' work here, is that the only way you can learn what it is you're passionate about, or let's use a different category, what it is you're gifted at, even professionally, is to try things and to be able to reflect on the things that you're trying. Like, oh, wow, I got all jazzed up in that meeting. Turns out I love working in groups and brainstorming. Or whoa, I got foggy brained and I just really, my energy went way down when I had to do this very detailed follow through task. And so experimentation and then reflecting on that experimentation and doing that quite intentionally in a journal with a brain trust with other people and stacking those different realizations up to learn about yourself is more active data than trying to sort of search our brains and our hearts at any given point and ask ourselves what we're passionate about. So it's really that North Star, passion as North Star, that I'm not feeling, because I don't think it works as much. And it's the discovery process that leads towards an ongoing sense of North Star that I would advocate for.
Yeah, and I have to admit that when I started working this particular field, I was really on board with a lot of career principles and theories about focusing on passion and pursuing passion for work and having your best work life. And that's beautiful and ideal. What I am finding now, what I am having a different perspective on, is that's really something to be said from a place of privilege.
Yeah.
I just have to name that. I think you know that too. Not everyone has the privilege to think, what am I really good at? Or what am I really excited about? Sometimes they just have to do work for paycheck, for bills, for responsibilities. And that's okay. And that's not outside of God's will, I would argue. Right. And I mean, I can go off on this. I won't, but I just want to say that it is definitely a place of privilege to be able to say that. It's not everyone's reality, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you can't pursue meaning and purpose through another channel.
Absolutely. Amen. 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 I was doing another conversation a few weeks ago about this book, and somebody called in. It was a radio show, and they said, I live in a poor state, and there are not really opportunities for us to think about economic mobility, much less purpose and meaning. And Maggie, I went right where you just went, which is, first of all, let's admit and let's name the privileged nature of the passion conversation. I also think there's a bit of a lineage there, right? So for the large swath of human history, work has been mostly a utilitarian function. It doesn't mean people didn't like their work. It doesn't mean people weren't passionate about their work, but that was never really supposed to be the equation. And then you get the move from agrarian to people, starting to have technology and industrialization, and humans starting to think about, okay, well, what might we do and how might we approach things? And there's this whole lineage there, and it's honestly really linked to our Protestant faith. Like as a Protestant person, there's a whole lineage here in terms of, and it's woven up with calling. So to name that, yes. And this is why it's good for all of us to go back to the basics. Like, okay, it's like, what is the most meaningful work I'm going to do today? Oh, maybe it's this right here. Like maybe this is actually, and probably is, like this probably is the most meaningful thing I'm going to do today. But does this matter more than the emails I'm going to go answer later, or the call that I've got right after this? Like, no, it actually doesn't. So maybe it matters more to me, but does it matter more to God? Going back to who's the meaning in the eyes of? And I think that that's helpful, because much of the time and in many seasons, it is good and holy for work to be a paycheck, even more than it is this purposeful expression of selves. And as people of faith, I think we ought to be always moving toward greater alignment with God. And so we're naturally asking questions of meaning and purpose. And so we get back to that dissatisfaction and curiosity, or overwhelmness and hope. We get back to that feeling of, now and not yet, right? As believers.
Yeah. I want to just point attention to the chat to say thank you for those who are engaging and sharing resources. I love that. Continue to do so. you are all coming in here with your own perspective, your own experiences, your own resources. And so feel free to share as experts also. I'm going to ask Lilia at this time, just to cut into me talking and asking all the questions. I'm gonna ask Lilia to share maybe one question so far from the question form that we can ask Michaela, maybe one that seems to have a common theme with other questions submitted.
Sure. They're actually, I'd say they're all pretty different. But one that was asked earlier in the session, Michaela, what helped you process your grief about graduating during a recession?
Gosh, that's such a good question. I don't know that I processed my grief as I was graduating in the midst of a recession. I think I was, like many of us do, and I think that we're wired neurologically to do, though now I'm stepping outside my expertise, I was in fight or flight mode, right? I was in fight or flight mode, which was survival mode. I was not thriving. And yet there was this capacity to notice like uncharted paths or opportunities. And I would say that that is quite honestly probably a product of my family system. And both my parents own their own business. They're both entrepreneurs. And so I don't know that it was that I was coming up with really doing the grief work in that moment and coming up with creative solutions about our way forward, or just doing what I knew, right? And oddly enough, that was my survival tactic. So let me talk instead about the grief tools that I've developed since, and how to more quickly recognize when grief is happening now. I'm a talker, I'm a talker. And I've got some people in my life that are very gracious with me, probably three, not a ton. Three, I mean, more people are gracious than me in that way. In this particular facet, who would listen to me, and who would listen to me and not tell me what to do. And not tell me, and part of this is like I'm making sense of it after it's happened, so there really wasn't a lot of being told, but just helping me process. The other thing that I had to develop in that time period was some language and some framework about the relationship between pain points and longings. Okay, so I had a lot of pain points and frustrations and disappointments in that season, and in time I became through different just life process, relationships, my own work honestly was pretty formative in this, my dissertation work, my work at the Pree Center. I learned that each of these pain points revealed that I had longings, right? And actually this has become an exercise that's in the book and that we do with people at the Pree Center. And it's a long process of steps, but the basis is go ahead and name what it is that's causing you frustration, disappointment, and where you feel stuck. And go put those on a list, put them on sticky notes, whatever your medium of choice is. And after you do that, see if you can name what each of those pain points, frustrations, or disappointments reveal about what it is you're longing for. And all of a sudden you've got a list now that's not as much rooted in the really tough stuff, but it's a little bit reframed toward, okay, this is actually what I'm longing for, which is a different conversation and starts to move from the stuck to unstuck. So Lilia, to that question, I've learned to activate that process more quickly now. And I've learned to do the pain point and the longing reframe as a part of my grief work when I had a difficult conversation with a coworker, or like I said, when a book that I just worked on isn't unfolding, it's not coming out when I expected it to. It's like, oh, that kind of was hard in some ways. I had to do some grief work. And so that tool has become a catalyst for my grief work. So I don't think I did a ton at the time. I think I had to learn those tools in relationship with other people along the way. But now that I've done more of that, I can more quickly access the grief work I know is necessary for all the generativity and creativity that might follow.
I'm so glad that question was asked, and it actually flows nicely into what I hope we start to discuss, or we start concluding this webinar discussing some of these more like practical, tangible, like now what sorts of concepts, and talking about grief. I know that that is actually a concept that you mentioned at several points of the book, and particularly inside of a whole chapter on building resilience, what you learned over time in your own research. So I wondered if, in talking about resilience, which we know building resilience can help us navigate through all the changes in our career lives and in our lives, period. You particularly focus on grief, fear, and hope. I wondered if you can speak a little bit more why those three, or any part of that that you'd actually want to discuss that you feel like would be helpful for someone to, as they're thinking about how to build resilience, how to navigate through those emotions.
Yeah, that's great. Resilience, sometimes called grit, even though it means a different thing, is often cited as the top, or one of the top skills that people need in order to be able to thrive in this world of work. And that's because there's so much change, and we have to anticipate change and therefore build muscles of resilience. So two things here. When I was doing my own research, it lined up with the data that was already out there. And that is that people who can really progress forward, I like to say that they can flex three muscles. One is creativity, one is resilience, and one is relationships. And the more I started looking at this, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like the Christian faith. The creativity, this is our first story about God. Resilience, this is our climactic story in Christ. And relationships, like, hello, the church. I'm like, whoa, so what you're saying, textbooks and research projects and et cetera, what you're saying is the very skills that are going to help in this moment are core to the DNA of what it means to believe in the story of God and in Jesus. That was very encouraging to me. And so much so that I've started to think about resilience and this is like where I can't help but get just a little preachy, as a gift of the resurrection. So, we have the resurrection, and because Jesus we know that death and failure and loss will never have the final word, and therefore we are not defined by them, right? Yeah. Amen. Yeah. It just like they don't. And so that capacity to say amen, that ability to be like, yeah, it's actually gives us the, what? Yeah, it's an exhale, right?
Okay.
And in that exhale, there is permission to try and fail, not just to be the recipient of grace that comes our way as a result of a resurrected Christ, but as people who can say, we're grafted into a story of God that covers failure. And therefore we can try, and we can step out there. Because one of the things that I encounter is that in my own work, especially at the Pree Center, is that we've all got different relationships with risk. We don't really want to fail. It kind of feels bad. It feels bad to me when I fail. Just yesterday, literally yesterday, my supervisor, who I love, she gave me feedback on something, and it was like something for me to improve on. And the brain part of me was like, feedback is good. Like, I'm grafted into the story of God. I can be resilient. And then the feeling part of me was like, no, this doesn't feel good. I don't like this. Like, I don't want to get this feedback. And so I want to acknowledge that it's not an easy thing, but there is a coming to grips. There is a bit that we can walk into. And so I often invite people to work on risk taking with the anticipation that some of those risks will not work out, as a means to reminding ourselves that in us, we've got the muscles of resilience, whether those are fine-tuned or not. And a particular kind of risk that I like to invite people in is one called next doable risk. Okay. So I'm from Nebraska. We talk about, we use farm idioms a lot. And so we talk a lot about bet the farm kind of risk, right? You got to go big. You're making a big career transition. And those risks, most of the time, are pretty scary, Maggie. And we look at them for a long time from a distance, and we don't necessarily go toward them. Now, some of us, we love risk, and, if that is you, I'm so glad that God has made you that way. And that is not how everybody else functions. Please come teach the rest of us a bit more about risk. So I've decided that on the opposite end of the spectrum is something called next doable risk. These are risks that you already have the resources to do, and you can do in the next 7 days. What I mean by resources you already have to do, you already have relationships, you already have an email, you already have a camera, or I mean, literally, I'm thinking about, I'm now imagining, you can tell different risks people have taken, but it's something you've got the resources to do, and that can be done in the next 7 days. And that gets us back to the experimentation of discovering more about ourselves that stacks up to all the passion and the big revelations. And so I like to encourage people that in order to build and recognize we've got muscles of resilience, first we realize where we sit in the whole picture as a child of God, which allows us to engage in these next doable risks.
I love it. I think I'm going to pause and ask Lilia if there is another question or two, maybe 2 questions that we can take from the group. Yeah, let's just do that for now.
Sure.
Thank you, Michaela, so far.
Oh, I love this conversation.
Okay. Hold on. Currently, I feel lost and like my gifts are not being fully utilized. What is the criteria I should use when making the decision to leave the work I am currently doing, especially if I am 54? Or should I stay to help some things change?
Oh, such a good question. Of course, there's, again, lots of context and specifics here. I will tell you about a different person and see if any of this is resonant. I was having a conversation with somebody's in my network, and they know I like to talk about work, and they're considering a career transition. I think they're somewhere between 58 and 60 years old. And they called and they said, can we just talk a little bit? I think I want to, my work, I'm getting a lot of, this is not going well. It was kind of it. It's not going well. My gifts aren't being realized. It's, I have a lot more pressure to do things at a faster pace, and, nothing that has to do anything with their capacities, but with the increasing demands of the workforce. And this person's in healthcare. And I said, okay, so let's talk about this. We're in the middle of the Great Resignation. In this moment, there is more job mobility than there has been in a long time. And that actually, for people who are workers, there's more bargaining chips, more tools. It's like we're talking about a housing market. Is it a buyer's market or a seller's market? Yeah, right now in the job market, it's a bit of a worker's market, and that's not usually or often the case.
Yeah.
So wouldn't you agree, Maggie? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there has been like a new wave of openness to consider, adapting a role, expanding a role, changing a role, new roles. So in that way, I do think that it's a bit more of the workers market.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just buy what I'm saying for a second. Say that it's more of a workers market than it usually is. It's certainly more of a workers market than it was in April of 2020 when people were just trying to hold on to jobs, right?
Yeah.
Because certainly they've come out of that. Then you start to think, okay, well, what might it look like to, we spend most of our time, I get an image of an ostrich. We got our head in the sand. We're sort of plugging along in the day to day, doing our work, doing our life, everything else. What might it look like to take this larger thing that's happening around us and pull our head out of the sand a little bit, and to do a little bit of exploring, maybe to look at job descriptions, maybe to recraft a resume, maybe to have a conversation with, maybe this isn't the first step, but maybe eventually a conversation with people we work with or for about redesigning or recasting our role. So in terms of the criteria that you might use in this moment, I'll go back to the criteria being the results of experimentation. So it's kind of like you're doing a little bit of experimenting, and what happens? When you're pressing on those doors, do they open? Do they feel like they're kind of directing you here? What is the feedback that you're getting from those people who know you well? And that it's the result of those things that stack up to that. Again, I'll add the caveat that some of us are in really toxic situations, and if that's where you're at, it may, and I have said to people, it might be worth taking another job that doesn't even feel like a great fit, just so you can get into a different space and reclaim like your well-being, and then from a place of well-being, launching into some of the experimentation I just talked about. So in terms of what criteria to use, I would go back to that experimentation.
Thank you, Michaela. Just because of time,
Diane.
I'm gonna. Oh. Yes.
I was just nodding to Diane.
Good. It's truly interactive. I'm now just kind of bummed that we didn't set this as a 90-minute thing versus 60-minute, but I want to start just kind of recapping what we've discussed so far and then ask you one final question on
Sure.
Your favorite discernment practices through these career transitions and this changing landscape of work. So before I ask you to share that, just to recap, I think what we've discussed so far is that meaningful work and defining meaning is not just in how we feel about it in that given day, it's really in how God sees our work. And we want to move towards God's work in the world in whatever way that looks, whatever season that is, paid or unpaid. That has nothing to do with our value or our worth. It is simply the way that we participate and co-labor with God in God's world for God's people. The other thing is, as we're navigating how to pursue meaningful work and discerning if our current work is the place that we're supposed to be at, that takes a body of discernment, some spiritual exercises, relationship with people, and some really, it does take time to think through this part. And we have to be okay with doable risks. And we have to be okay with, sometimes that means failure, or I won't even call it failure, but just pivoting and reorienting ourselves. Michaela, is there anything else that you'd want to say to summarize what we've discussed so far?
Oh, just that you're a good synthesizer, Maggie. That was impressive. Good job. Yeah, I don't know that I would have anything else to add to that. I think you did a good job summarizing.
Yeah, and I just want to name, I know that individuals came here with some personal circumstances and specific questions, and I do want those to be addressed. I just know that they won't all be addressed, or probably haven't all been addressed in this one session. Please know that following this event, we will be sending the recording. I will also be sending resources that both the Pree Center and our office, Fuller Careers and Personal Development, have to offer to help you with your individual processing and further next steps that you might want to engage in. So you won't be left alone after this particular webinar is done. Before we end our time today, Michaela, I wanted to really highlight God's work in these spaces that we're in these moments, in our feelings, in the transition, in our lack of clarity, and really wanting to highlight the need to lean in and listen to God and listen with God. And I just thought it'd be fun to hear from you. What are your own spiritual discernment practices that you are currently engaging with when you're in the season of your life?
Yeah, it's good. I've got a couple. One, the rhythm of Sabbath is actually very important for me. Sabbath is one of those things, I think, that it's like Christianity 101, and yet it's so hard to access. And for me, it's just the basic question of whose kingdom am I aligned with, right? And like, whose kingdom am I aligned with? And if I am busy and producing, and of course I'm a mom, so I can't just totally turn all my work off, but I can feel when I'm out of alignment. I just can. So Sabbath is really critical. I also, there's an organization I love. They're called Attune, and they have developed a series of spiritual practices that help people listen to their body as a source of knowing about what God is saying. And they do these both for individuals and in groups. And I will say that in these guided practices, which we can link to as well, and they have some available like online, I didn't even know what my body knew, y'all. I didn't even know that was such a source of knowing and untapped. And that's been very, very revelatory. God has spoken to me a lot through some of those practices over the last few years.
Thanks for sharing, Michaela.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up our time here, I'm just excited to share that we're actually going to be doing a random drawing for any two of you all who are here on the screen. Will get a copy of this book for free, thanks to Michaela and her generosity. I'm also happy to share that if you wanted to go step by step through this book, there's actually a resource on Fuller Equip, which is a resource and a platform that Fuller students and alumni have access to. That particular resource or module, you can purchase either for $25, or if you purchase the book through a particular link that I'll include in our post-event email, you can get the book and also a code to the Fuller Equip resource that walks you through this. There is also a ton of other resources I will be linking. We don't have enough time to mention them now, but There will be more on vocational myth busting that Michaela and her team helped put together, some resources from our office on discernment, and anything else that you need, feel free to reach out to careers@fuller.edu. I'll ask Lilia to drop that into the chat, and we are happy to point you in the right direction, whether it's through our office or someone else. Michaela, any final words, and will you conclude for us in prayer beyond those words as well?
Yeah, just thank you for all the work that went into this, and thank you each just for the journeys you're on. Let's pray. God, just thank you for students and alumni and friends, Lord. I trust that you're doing holy work in and around all of us, God. I pray that you would give us eyes to see and ears to hear, even when we feel discouraged and overwhelmed, and maybe especially when we feel anxious and lonely, that you're with us, guiding us, even if it's little micro steps at a time. Thank you that you are a God of small and often bland details, Lord. We love you and we thank you for this time. We pray these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. Blessings to your day, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're happy to have you. Bye, Michaela. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you for watching this video. To view more career resources, go to quad.fuller.edu/careers. If you have any other questions, feel free to email our office at careers@fuller.edu. Thank you and have a wonderful day.